Thank you, Andrea, for your presentation, and congratulations on your award. So the theme of this meeting is confluence, science, people, knowledge, and today's plenary speaker is a scientist whose work unites all three, Dr. Sapna Sharma. Dr. Sharma is a professor in the Department of Biology at York University and the Inaugural Director of the United Nations Institute for Training and Research Global Water Academy. Science. Dr. Sharma studies the impacts of climate change and other environmental stressors on lakes. Foundational research from her lab, published in Nature and Science, shows that globally, lakes are freezing less often, for shorter periods of time, or for the very last time. In recognition of her work, Dr. Sharma has been inducted to the Royal Society of Canada of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists, has received the President Emerging Research Leadership Award from York University, the Early Researcher Award from the Faculty of Science and the Ontario Ministry of Innovation and Training, and she has also been named one of Canada's top 10 women water scientists. People. Cold winters play a very important role in people's sense of place and culture. Much of what Dr. Sharma's research focuses on is the concern that both scientists and the public share about what happens when lakes lose ice cover. Research from her lab shows that as lakes lose ice, people will also lose access to winter recreation, cultural traditions, transportation, and food security. Dr. Sharma draws on the human connection to winter through various projects such as the Community Lake Ice Collaboration Project, which collects volunteer observations of lake ice duration across the United States. To date, this project has compiled more than 52,000 lake ice phenology observations across over 1,000 lakes, contributed by over 900 community scientists in over 30 years. And those community observations have contributed to dozens of global syntheses on lake ice loss. And finally, knowledge. Scientific discoveries can be powerful when they are shared, understood, and applied. Dr. Sharma is a dedicated science communicator whose work and its broader significance has been widely featured in the National Geographic, NPR, BBC News, and the New York Times. From the words of her colleagues at York University's One Water Institute, Dr. Sharma's work brings together science, policy, and public engagement to illuminate the future of freshwater ecosystems and help protect them for generations to come. Dr. Sharma has fundamentally advanced our understanding of how climate change is impacting the Earth's lakes and why that matters for the human communities that depend on them. Welcome, Dr. Sapna Sharma.
Thanks so much, Aaliyah, for that really kind introduction. And thanks so much, everyone, for staying here today on a Friday night so late. So I appreciate it. I appreciate the invitation. And I'm going to talk to you about ice for the next 40 minutes. Before I begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge all of the people and funding agencies that have been instrumental to this research. And I can't start talking about ice without recognizing Dr. John Magnuson from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who introduced me to lake ice when I was a postdoc. I was taking Steve Carpenter's modeling class, and I needed a long time series to work with. So he said, hey, here's a long time series. It's Lake Mendota's ice time series for 150 years. And I was like, great, this is awesome. I'll work on this time series. And then a week later, he came by, and he's like, well, do you want another time series? And I was like, sure. And he gave me Lake Monona's time series. And from there, we've worked on hundreds of lakes. So really wanted to thank him for including me in that lake ice research. I want to make sure I thank my students and collaborators, particularly Gleon. That's been really instrumental in this global research, and of course, funding organizations. I'm going to start with the important lessons I hope to convey today that are kind of like integral in the themes, but I just wanted to explicitly state them. So first, the importance of incorporating diverse knowledge systems. from indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, Western science, and incorporating that to understand climate change and its effects on lakes. Secondly, the importance of including diverse voices, experiences, expertise, and data types into our science that can really reveal how lakes are responding to climate change. You'll see some indication of communicating our research. And finally, something I really learned working in the UN sphere for the last few years is that as scientists, we have a big impact on with our collective research. And it's not just, I think everybody in this room has a lot of impact that translates into policy, into real change. So I just wanted to emphasize that as we go through. So there'll be two aspects that I'll be talking about today. So first, how and why is lake ice changing? And second, how is ice safety changing? And there's several reasons why I really like working with ice. So the first, people have used ice for centuries, and it's been ingrained in the culture and communities of northern communities worldwide. So for example, before refrigerators, ice was harvested from local rivers and lakes to keep food cold. Millions of people flock to festivals over the winter to celebrate whatever experiences they might want to celebrate in the winter. You've all been in Montreal for this week, so you know hockey is important in Canada, and lake ice has played a prominent role for ice hockey. I grew up in Brantford, Ontario, which is the home of Wayne Gretzky, so like ice has just been a fundamental way of life for Canadians. And then ice roads, connecting remote communities all over North America and Eurasia. And because lake ice is so important to so many communities, lake ice data have actually been collected for centuries and long before the advent of meteorological stations. Our longest ice records actually come from religious sites. The longest record we have is from Lake Constance in Germany, with the record going back to 875 AD. And I'm going to talk about the Lake Suwa record in a bit more detail, but that ice record has been collected for millennia. Our best ice records actually come from gambling pools because so many people are actually observing ice on and ice off, so we have high certainty about ice dates. And then, of course, community science initiatives like Aaliyah mentioned earlier. So I inherited the Community Lake Ice collaboration from Dr. Ken Stewart from the SUNY Buffalo about 7 years ago. And he started this initiative in the 1980s where he reached out to hundreds of Americans around the US, around 5 US states. And what we do is we send them letters. We basically have a pen pal system. So we send them letters asking them for the date that their lakes froze and thawed, the ice thawed, and then they send us some information about the winter that they experienced. So we do this with people all across the US, but also all around the world as a way of kind of getting some of these ice records that I'm going to talk about today. And because ice data has been collected for so long, ice has actually been studied for a very long time. So I was reading the English literature, and it would go back to about the 1950s, 1960s on ice. And I had a fantastic postdoc come into my lab, Kirill Shapov, who was originally from Siberia, and he could read Russian and German. And so we went back to the Russian-German literature. Josh Culpepper, another postdoc, went back through other literature. We worked with Japanese translators and linguists, and we found lake ice being studied for over 150 years. Some of the earliest scientists studying lake ice were actually Polish scientists who were exiled to Siberia, and they were publishing on, the drivers of lake ice in the 1880s. There was big data over 20,000 ice records compiled across the Russian Empire that are all available in a book. Some of those climate change oscillations were even talked about in the 1800s. And so it's a really humbling experience to go through more extensive literature to really understand how important ice is. So I'm going to tell you about my favorite ice record. It's from Lake Suwa in Japan. And this lake, there's a Shinto shrine on the shores of Lake Suwa. And 15 generations of Shinto priests have been recording the dates that Lake Suwa has frozen. But in their family, they've actually been recording and celebrating these dates for millennia. They're just not on paper that we can find. And the reason is because the Amawatari forms. There's a ridge that forms when the lake ice forms. And in the Shinto tradition, the legend is that there was a god and goddess that lived together on the shores of Lake Suwa. And sometimes what happens after people live together for too long, they got into a disagreement and the goddess moved out. And she built herself a shrine on the other side of the lake. But every year when the lake froze, the god would cross the lake with his dragon to seek forgiveness from the goddess and would leave his footsteps behind. And so the Shinto priests for centuries have been celebrating the date and recording the date that the lake freezes, the Amawatari appears, and they gather important leaders from the community to celebrate and record this event. And John Magnuson went to Lake Suwa. He met with Mr. Miyasaka, the current chief priest, and Tadashi Arai, and they went through old diaries on rice paper, and they translated it into Excel spreadsheets. And that's where I came in, where I got to use the data. But interestingly, Mr. Miyasaka, we correspond by mail, and we send him our papers. And in our last Zoom call, he wanted to share that he started using Excel, and he plotted all his data. He's been recording air temperature and water temperature, and he wanted to show us his correlations that he's generated. So we're doing some cross-cultural exchanges, which has been fun. But there's lots of things we can do with this data. So I'm going to show you something pretty straightforward. So simply looking at the number of years that the lake did not freeze in a 50-year period. And what you can see in the first 250 years of the record, Lake Suwa did not freeze 3 times. And that actually corresponded to widespread famine in the region with the failure of the rice crop. The next 250 years were a different story, and you can see that there's more ice-free events. We're able to identify when the third industrial revolution started in the Lake Suwa region, and it was in the early 1800s. There was more urbanization, increase in human population, widespread deforestation. That was all contributing to increased warming and resulting in increases in ice-free events. So 1950 to 1999, the lake did not freeze 1 out of every 5 years. Since 1990, the lake does not freeze 8 out of every 10 years. So we're seeing something very dramatic over time. And what we did was we modeled under every climate change scenario that was available at the time, at what point would Lake Suwa never freeze again? There wasn't a single model that forecasted freezing of Lake Suwa after 2040, regardless of how low the greenhouse gas emissions were. So this tradition that's lasted millennia may soon be lost in the coming decades. But Lake Suwa is not the only lake that's starting to experience ice-free winters. We've been tracking quite a few lakes that have data going back over a century, and we're finding that since 1970, there are more ice-free years. Here I worked with the graphic artist at the New York Times who helped animate some of our results. And what you can see in orange are lakes that no longer freeze reliably every winter. And there's about 15,000 that we predict using the Hydro Lakes data, actually. And with temperature increases, you can see that more lakes are at risk of becoming experiencing ice-free years. And so that's something we've called intermittent ice cover, from 35,000 to 215,000, depending upon the degree of warming. We took this a step further to identify which lakes would be at risk of permanent ice loss at the end of this century. And what you can see in the right-hand panel is under high greenhouse gas emission scenarios, there are about 5,700 lakes that may permanently lose ice cover by the end of this century. However, even modest decreases in greenhouse gas emissions can really improve the situation where only 429 lakes are forecasted to permanently lose ice cover. So when somebody asks me, what can we do to preserve ice cover, I always say, first thing we need to do is mitigate our greenhouse gas emissions because of that strong link with air temperatures. Who are the lakes that are at highest risk? So lakes that are found in southern and coastal regions where winter air temperatures are hovering around or exceeding 0 degrees Celsius are at risk of losing ice cover, but also very deep lakes, even in colder regions. So I told you about the example of Lake Constance. The last time Lake Constance froze was 1963. They actually had a major ice cream festival on the lake in that year, but it hasn't frozen again, and we don't expect it to freeze. There's about 100 lakes in Switzerland and Germany that have actually already shifted to this permanent ice-free status. Other lakes you might be familiar with are some of the Great Lakes. So bays in Lake Superior and Lake Michigan are experiencing ice-free conditions, and under greenhouse gas emissions, we forecast that they may lose ice permanently by 2060 under greenhouse gas emission scenarios, or 2080 under moderate, but not at all, continuing to freeze under low greenhouse gas emission scenarios. What about the millions of lakes that still freeze every year? What we're finding is that ice is being lost at rapid rates. So in this study, we kind of redid and expanded John Magnuson's seminal study published in Science in 2000, and we expanded our data set with the number of lakes and also our time series. And what we noticed, so John's data ended in 1995. I don't know if you can't see 1995 on there, but for the ISON time, there was like a really dramatic decline and later ice freeze dates since John's study. So we calculated it, and we found that on average, lakes are losing about 18 days per century of ice cover. But Lake Superior, the bays in Lake Superior were actually losing ice at the fastest rates, and they've lost about 60 days of ice cover since 1854, when the data started. Interestingly, in the last 25 years, the rates of warming are 6 times faster, and at like this alarmingly fast rate of 108 days per century. Why? Why is ice melting earlier and freezing later? If we'd read the Russian literature in the 1800s, we wouldn't have had to do all of this study. But it's predominantly climate change. So climate change overwhelmingly explains the variation in ice loss. So warmer air temperatures leads to less ice. And those warmer air temperatures are highly correlated to increases in carbon dioxide emissions. Local weather patterns, such as temperature, precipitation, snow cover, that all corresponds to changing ice phenology as well. And then large-scale climate drivers. So the El Nino Southern Oscillation Index, North Atlantic Oscillation Index, solar sunspots, those all play a role in ice states, particularly when you're looking at them over long time scales. But interestingly, what we found in our ice records was that we're seeing this fundamental change in climate change drivers. because of climate warming in the ice record. So for example, the North Atlantic Oscillation used to be considered a 50-year cycle. But now what we're seeing is that it's actually operating at like 6 to 10 years, which really illustrates the impacts of climate change and how it can affect these teleconnections, and then what does that mean for extreme events. What about for the future? A PhD student in my lab, Aman Bazou, who's going to defend on Tuesday, did this work to project future ice loss and ice duration. So we used the latest climate change scenarios, the SSP scenarios, and what he found was that on average, lakes may lose an additional 10 to 28 days of ice cover by the end of the century, depending upon the degree of warming. We've also been looking at ice quality. So I've been talking about ice phenology for now, but now we've been moving into ice quality. Gesa Wainmeyer from Uppsala University during the pandemic did a great study, a GLION study, where she asked a bunch of us to look at the ice quality. So the clear ice, the black ice, which transmits more light, actually has 2 times the load-bearing capacity as white ice. But warmer winters, wetter winters are contributing to increased white ice growth. So Joshua Culpepper, a postdoc in my lab, has been looking at ice quality and the implications. So for example, if you have more white ice, you actually have less light transmission going through the under ice water cover, and that can have implications for under ice ecology. And also, as I mentioned, white ice is about half as strong at 0 to -5 degrees Celsius as black ice. So in Sweden, even though in 2020, in February, people were skating on the ice, it was 10 centimeters thick, which is what is a recommended guideline, but the ice core was mostly made up of white ice, and 10 people drowned through that ice core. So the quality really has an impact on strength. And so Josh and Kirill and Ryan Scott and Kevin Vikstrom have been working on understanding how ice quality and under ice ecology differ across lakes and winters. Josh will be talking about this tomorrow in the under ice ecology session at 4:30. So if you're around, it would be great. You can find out more. But I wanted to show this picture. So we worked on 2 lakes. We sampled 2 lakes, a large suburban lake, Lake Simcoe, and Paint Lake, which is a forested lake, small rural lake, forested lake. And these ice measurements were taken on the same day. So typically they experience a similar climates. They're only an hour apart from each other. But in Lake Simcoe, you see that there's no snow on the lake. The fetches, wind is removing all that snow off the lake, but the ice is very clear. It's the black ice there. But in Paint Lake, it was just a white ice core, and it was so weak, you can see that it's kind of fractured in half. And I'm giving away Josh's punchline, but this is what we found. So we measured it during a warm, dry winter in 2024 and a cold, very snowy winter in 2025. And what we found was less ice actually increased light penetration, especially without snow. You only needed about 3 centimeters of snow or higher, and that decreased actually most of the light going through the ice column. We also found colder under ice water temperatures, higher dissolved oxygen concentrations, and increased primary production. But we actually encountered like an unexpected finding. So I mentioned we were working in Paint Lake, the rural study. It has 2 basins. There's a small eastern basin next to a pretty small road, and the western basin that's a bit deeper, but there wasn't any roads that were salted during the winter. And we thought maybe there's something wrong with our measurements at first, because the benthic water temperatures were over 6 degrees Celsius. in the shallow basin. And then we also noticed anoxic conditions. Oxygen concentrations were less than 1 milligram per liter. And it continued in the cold winter. The lake didn't even mix fully. So anoxia, even in June, July, anoxia was still present. And we found it was because of road salt. So even a small road in a rural setting had this dramatic impact on under ice water quality. So next I'm going to go into how is ice safety changing. So we were, during the pandemic, more people were, or even before then, lots of people are using lakes, and we were hearing of people drowning through ice. And so we put together a GLEON project to document the number of winter drownings. And we created a time series ranging from 1 year in Russia to over 30 years in Canada. And we quantified the number of winter drownings. It actually took us a long time to figure out that there's a death code by drownings. So we actually had all of the ways actually that Americans had died. And the poor data scientist who was working on the project trying to figure out the death code for drowning through ice had nightmares of all the different ways he could die. And but then we figured out the code, and we called coroner's offices, life-saving societies, police stations around the world, and we made this graph. And the interesting thing is that we correlated it with winter air temperatures. So at the bottom of the axis, we've got winter air temperatures, and on the y-axis, we have number of winter drownings per capita. And before the 0 degrees Celsius line, you see this exponential relationship. So as winter air temperatures approach 0 degrees Celsius, you see extremely high rates of winter drownings per capita. So, for example, Estonia and Latvia. But there were exceptions. And it was really interesting to figure out why there were exceptions. So Italy and Germany had really low winter drownings. And it turned out that there's really strong regulations on when people can go out to on the lakes and what they can do on those lakes, and people abide by those rules. The other outlier was the Northern Territories in Canada. And Alaska, actually. So the North in North America had the highest drownings per capita, even though the air temperatures were really cold. When we looked into this further, we also found that they had the highest search and rescue events in the North, and it was because of the reliance of ice for travel, for hunting, for fishing, for everyday activities that contributed to increased drowning events. This is the saddest graph I'm going to show you today. That's why we made it really colorful. But we looked at the age groups. In Minnesota, they told you who the drowners were and what they were doing before they were involved in a tragedy. And children under 9 were the most vulnerable to drowning while playing on ice. They were just curious. The other high drowners were young men from 15 to 24, mostly snowmobiling, not aware of maybe taking more risks, maybe under the influence of alcohol, having increased fatalities. And so this really made a deep impact in me, so my passion is now on ice safety. And so we've done a lot of subsequent studies on ice safety. So here we were looking at what about safe ice? So I worked with Istin Woolway, Lei Wang, and we identified, which grid cells have ice that's less than 10 centimeters thick, so that would be safe use of ice. And what we found was the latitude between 40 and 45 degrees north, where most of the people live in North America, had an 80% reduction in safe ice with just a 3 degrees Celsius warming. Aman, in his second chapter, Ahmad Bazou was looking at ice quality, and because in our previous estimates, we assumed that all these ice was black ice. And knowing that white ice is weaker and about half the load-bearing capacity, we looked at ice quality for around the Northern Hemisphere and found that load-bearing capacity, it actually doesn't take very much ice to decrease load-bearing capacity. So 1 centimeter decline in black ice and white ice thickness can reduce the load-bearing capacity by 460 kilograms. And under future climate change scenarios with changing ice thicknesses, that could render ice more hazardous for millions of people. So we're trying to do something about it, where I'm the lead PI on a new project, international project called Arctic Roots, and we're really interested in identifying how communities across the north adapt to less safe ice conditions. We're moving beyond lake ice. So Lisa Pickering, who's here, she's working in Istin Woolway's lab and working with me as well. She's looking at how lake ice, sea ice, and snow is changing and will change under future conditions. What that means for transportation infrastructure, including ice roads, snowmobile access, marine shipping routes, and then what that means for food security. We actually have quite a bit of our project focused on caribou and reindeer. We're working with Sami hunters in Scandinavia, looking at reindeer hunting and seeing how changing ice and snow and avalanche conditions are contributing to changing reindeer herding patterns, and then what that means for health, physical health, but also mental health and well-being. So this is a cartoon we made summarizing 14 billion data points. All of the figures that I've presented, they're like summaries of a lot of data, but we try to make it colorful so it's easier to look at. And what you can see is that as temperatures warm, the ice that's required for ice roads and even vehicle use by the end of the century may be lost. We're working with Inuit elders in the Arctic, in Pond Inlet, Rhoda Katsik and Joshua Katsik, who are teaching the young about safely using ice and harvesting fish and seals with these changing ice conditions. So we're running workshops with Inuit youth, talking about safely traveling on thinning ice in the spring and falls, where they're teaching them how to safely harvest in those seasons as well, so that knowledge continues across generations. We're also working with this amazing Inuit artist, Brian Kowichuk, who creates murals and children's books to teach Inuit hunters, but also Inuit children about climate change, but through a lens of hope and mental health resilience. So this is a mural he created that's going up as we speak in Tuktoyaktuk. And the idea is that when hunters come off the ice, they'll see this mural, and it's supposed to share this vision of hope and well-being. And we must recognize that climate change in the Canadian High Arctic must incorporate these Inuit visions of resilience in the face of rapidly changing environments, and ensuring that that information is being passed on through generations. We're also creating some safety interventions. So Geisa Wainmeyer led this calculation. It was really enlightening. So I just want you to look at the 10 centimeter mark, and she estimated what the allowable load on ice, if you have 10 centimeters of black ice, it allows for 1,200 kilograms of ice of load-bearing capacity. But if that ice core is made up of 10 centimeters of all white ice, that only can support 120 kilograms. And so that really set the stage for why those Swedish skaters drowned and fell through the ice, because a white ice core can hold just a fraction of load-bearing capacity that black ice can. I also work very closely with journalists every year because they get the message out. So we get millions of media impressions every year since 2020. We work with the Life Saving Society and the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, just getting out the message of safety, ice safety, recommending safety interventions all over the world in hopes, and we do it at the beginning of winter, during winter, and when the ice is most dangerous, just to remind people to be safe on ice. And it's actually having an impact. So on the left-hand panel, you can see the number of drownings by age. From 1976 to 2000, you can see that it was predominantly young people, and there was quite a few drownings. The recent time period, we're seeing a decline in drownings, and in the last 6 years, there have been tragedies, but only one child had a fatal drowning in the last 6 years, when before they were the -- 1 vulnerable age group. The same is true with young adults. The drowning rates are declining. Our new group of people that we're going to have to target is the middle-aged men, who are actually, they might even be drowning at higher rates than they were in the past. So we're talking to our colleagues at the CDC and Life Saving Society to figure out what are the best intervention strategies with that age group, and hopefully we'll see that continued decline. But I just wanted to end here, coming back to the lessons that I brought up at the beginning of the talk, and hopefully you could see that kind of woven in through all of the themes. And thanks again to all my collaborators and students, and thanks for staying here so late to listen to the talk. So we have about 5 minutes of question time. Yeah.
With all of the problems of global warming, how much agricultural land will Canada and Russia gain by global warming? And are those people fostering global warming?
That's an interesting question. I don't know the percentage. I think it depends on soil conditions, but I think there's also the issues of changes in hydrological patterns that might be relevant to agricultural use. So we are seeing increases in storm events, but also droughts in certain areas. So I think it's going to be up in the air of how much more agricultural land there might be, but it's an interesting
I think we're going to see a lot of human migration from areas that are strongly impacted and lose the ability to grow local foods.
Yeah. So, and also the people who are losing the ability to access water. So the last 3 years, I was like at the UN talking about water security. Like 2.2 billion people don't have access to clean water right now. And with climate change, there may be 2 billion people who may be living in regions that's too warm for them to survive. And so all of those people have to move. And we need to figure out water security. We need to figure that out, and pretty quickly. So it's a good point. All people deserve clean water, so we have to figure this out pretty soon. Thanks.
There seem to be some people who want global warming, and I'm trying to figure out why.
Okay, I am not one of them.
Thank you very much for a breathtaking talk where you took us from fundamental research to societal implications. You mentioned that the NAO, the North Atlantic Oscillation, may be shortening. Is a phenomenon shortening, or is our understanding of the phenomenon and the characteristics changing?
No, I think they're actually shortening. So El Nino is also shortening. I didn't show that graph because there was a lot of statistics involved in it. But, sorry. But, so when the Shinto priests were started collecting the ice record, the El Nino cycle was about 50 to 60 years long. And now it's about 3 to 8 years. And the same is true for NAO. So we're seeing this in the ice record, but they're also seeing this in drought records, in tree rings. Climate scientists are looking into this, and I think that may be contributing to more extreme events that we're seeing now because of the oscillations that have an impact. Yeah. Great, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for staying for this evening's event, and have a great evening. We'll see you tomorrow.